Hello and welcome to the second lecture of the online guest lecture series on Franz Kafka that is being organized by the Global Languages Center of the Global University. In the first guest lecture that was delivered by Dr. Shipra Chaturvedi, we discussed Kafkian language and the dilemmas that one faces while translating Kafka's texts. A translator has to almost always make difficult choices, especially because Kafka's work does not lend itself to domestication. Today, we turn our glance towards Kafka's animals. There are in his writings countless references to animals. He writes about human transformed into a vermin, about mice, about jackals, about an ape who transforms himself into a human, a vulture, leopards, tiger, and a few more. In his biography of Kafka, Pietro Chaitati notes, Kafka sensed an animal within him. In their book, Toward a Minor Literature, Deleuze and Guattari define his writing as essentially animalistic. In contemporary scholarship, Kafka has been hailed as a harbinger of animal studies and as a critic of anthropomorphism. In fact, the neologism Zoopoetics was coined by Jacques Derrida in reference to none other but Kafka's vast Zoopoetics, which also brings us to the title of today's talk, namely Liminal Creatures, Kafka's Zoopoetics. We are very fortunate to have amongst us Dr. Anu Pandey, who is the co-founder of the Indian Animal Studies Collective. Dr. Pandey has studied at the Center of German Studies in JNU and teaches in the Department of Germanic Studies at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. Her research interests include cultural and literary animal studies, Anthropocene literature, representations of disease and death in 20th and 21st century German, French, and American literature, discourses of violence and the post-war developments in West Germany, in particular the students' movement and the Rote Armee Fraktion. I'm very glad to have you with us, dear Anu. The stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Shruti, for these kind words of introduction and for the invitation. I am very, very pleased to be here, deeply honored to be one of the very august group of speakers that you have lined up for this series of talks. Also, I am very grateful because I have been on a kind of a mission of late, since about a couple of years, to try to popularize animal studies in India, starting out from the German studies departments to which I have more or less direct access, including in my own classrooms at the EFLU. And this gives me, of course, a stage to carry out my private agenda on a bigger platform. So thank you so much for that. I think it is also something that is important for the times that we live in. And Kafka, of course, a very great example of why animals are important and what roles they can play in literary texts. So I will just start sharing my slides now. Can you see the first slide? Great. Animals have always figured in diegetic and extra-diegetic worlds in various linguistic and cultural traditions. At the same time, philosophy and literary criticism have presumed that there is an unbridgeable chasm or fundamental difference between non-human and human animals, and adopted an anthropocentric outlook as the dominant approach. The present postmodern world, however, is far too complex to be arranged in such neat binaries of subject or object, nature, culture, center, periphery, or human animal. Recent theoretical and methodological approaches propose, for instance, that everything in the social and natural worlds exists in constantly shifting networks of relationships, and nothing exists outside those relationships. Nature and culture don't coexist alongside each other. Instead, they are inextricably entangled. The term used by Haraway for this is nature cultures as one word. The same holds true of the human-animal binary, which is increasingly being replaced with the terms human and non-human animal to make it clear that the human is in fact also an animal, or even humanimal, again a term used by Haraway. Acknowledging that, firstly, human and non-human animals have interacted with and upon each other for millennia, thereby mutually shaping each other. Secondly, one cannot be studied in isolation from the other. And thirdly, human and non-human animals share the same fragile planet and ecology and face the same threats. Since the latter half of the 20th century, there has been a paradigm shift in the academic field. Previously marginalized, silenced, or overlooked groups have increasingly become visible and audible, thanks to such diverse approaches as feminist studies, subaltern studies, critical race theory, queer theory, and disability studies, to name just a few. The development of animal studies can also be seen as a step in this direction. It is in this context that in recent years there has been a renewed and intense engagement with Franz Kafka's literary texts, resulting in a vast amount of scholarship about the animals and animality in his texts. Just a second, the slide won't go further. Shruti, should I stop sharing and try it again?
Try to click on the slide.
Yes. That's it. Thank you so much. I'd like to take you through the structure of my talk before I begin in earnest. So I will start out by talking about the relationship between non-human and human animals and draw attention to the four dominant perspectives that can be found here. The first being anthropological difference, the second entanglement, which I have just mentioned briefly, the third being asymptotic planetary alongsideness, and the fourth liminality, which is going to be the approach that I have adopted to look at Kafka's animals. In the next step, we will start looking at animals and animality in Kafka's texts under the rubric of liminality, in trying to see how and why they are liminal beings. We will also discuss the question of what is Zoopoetics at all, and further on, we will, in the last part, go on to read Kafka zoopoetically by looking at a few examples of his work. The first of these will be the human-animal hybrid that we find in his text Metamorphoses, in German Die Verwandlung. The second of these is species transition and species fluidity, as seen in a report to an academy, ein Bericht für eine Akademie. The third, which is based on investigations of a dog, Forschungen eines Hundes, is about caninocentrism and how that is a model of inversion of interspecies power relations. And in the fourth one, we will focus on Kafka's mice as they appear in two of his texts, Josephine, as well as Kleine Fabel. To start with the relationship between non-human and human animals, there are, broadly speaking, four ways of looking at the relationship between non-human and human animals in the real world as well as in literary texts. The first of these is anthropological difference, also known as the human-animal divide. Philosophy has historically defined the human as the only zoon, logon, ichon, or the only rational animal, or the only animal with speech or language. As an animal, therefore, but one endowed with reason and language. It has always opposed the human to all the rest of animal kind, going so far as to erase all animality in us, and conversely, to define the animal in an essentially negative way, as lacking in whatever is presumed to be characteristic of the human. Derrida lists some of these characteristics that humans are supposed to have, but animals are supposed to lack, speech, reason, experience of death, mourning, culture, institutions, techniques, clothing, lying, pretending, covering of tracts, giving gifts, tears, respect. The list is endless. This philosophical logocentrism is primarily a thesis regarding the animal deprived of the logos, deprived of the can have the logos, of the ability to have the logos at all. This is the thesis, position, or presupposition maintained from Aristotle to Heidegger, from Descartes to Kant, Levinas, and Lacan, writes Derrida. Because of this, literary criticism has read through non-human protagonists in literature, and thus these literary animals become invisible. The reason behind the selective attention and the distraction from non-human figures is anthropocentrism, a term coined in the 1860s to represent the view that humans are at the center of the universe. Animal studies and posthumanism see anthropocentrism as an ideology of human exceptionalism, which aims to uphold the centrality and prioritization of human existence, even as it at the same time marginalizes and subordinates non-human perspectives, interests, and beings. The first major questioning of anthropological difference, and in that sense a paradigm shift in evaluating the manner in which non-human animals were to be treated, emerged with Jeremy Bentham's oft-quoted question, can they suffer? So instead of asking, can they speak, can they build tools, can they develop complex societies, etc., Bentham chose to pose the question, can they suffer? And if the answer to that is yes, which it is, then one needs to rethink the way one treats non-human animals. The second way of perceiving the relationship between non-human and human animals is that of challenging the anthropological difference. The concept of entanglement proposed by Donna Haraway, who believes that the long history of human and non-human cohabitation is also the history of both having such profound impact on each other, such profound influence on each other, that the two cannot be separated from each other anymore and seen as two absolute entities that exist side by side. Instead, they are entangled inextricably. You can't differentiate between the two anymore and say this is where the human ends and the animal begins, or vice versa. She also proposes that the binaries of nature, culture, and human animal, therefore, are artificial. This is also because of the fact that all creatures on this planet share vulnerability and precarity. And if that is the case, then they cannot be differentiated on the basis of an anthropological difference. The third approach is that proposed by Dominic O'Kee in his recent book, narrating the war against animals, which he calls asymptotic planetary alongsideness, which challenges the notion of entanglement. So he proposes this as a rejection of the notion of entanglement. This does not smooth over differences. So it goes by the fact that there are differences between human and non-human animals, but it does not matter that these differences exist. They can still exist alongside each other at the planetary scale. And so Dominic O'Kee incorporates these differences instead in a new paradigm of the coexistence of non-human and human animals. The fourth approach is that of liminality and the so-called humanimal zone. Liminality possesses a quality of ambiguity. And that will show you immediately why I chose this lens to look at Kafka's texts, because if there is one word that one can associate almost immediately with Kafka, it is ambiguity. The term liminality comes from the Latin limen, or limit, and denotes the experience of being at or on a threshold. It refers to the passage from one state to another, as well as the moment of transition. It is best described as being in between, that is, neither one thing nor another, or both one thing and the other, or perhaps it is the state of being caught between the no longer and the not yet. In anthropology, the concept has been mostly used to describe the rites of passage that govern such an unsettling condition, such as initiation ceremonies, marriages, funerals, etc. The French ethnologist and folklorist Arnold van Gennep distinguished 3 consecutive periods: a separation phase, the liminal phase, and lastly, the integration phase, where the liminal subject is reincorporated. He called the middle stage the liminal period proper, and rites of integration or incorporation may thus be referred to more correctly as post-liminal rites. Kafka's human and non-human animals are liminal beings, without a doubt. They are neither human nor animal, or they are both human and animal. Some of the figures are humans, but they incorporate elements of non-human animality, and some of the animal figures have human characteristics. It is never clear which of the two they will finally be, or whether they will ever be any one of the 2 forms. This species fluidity indicates a radical suspension of the human-animal binary. Located as they are on the threshold between humanity and animality, Kafka's creatures thereby undermine the species barrier, creating a liminal human.
Suraj, would you please mute yourself?
Thank you.
Suraj, please mute yourself. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Shruti. So, Kafka's creatures are located on the threshold between humanity and animality, and in this way they undermine the species barrier, creating a liminal human-animal space, what we call here the humanimal zone. It is worth mentioning that this species fluidity and notion of the animalized human at the turn of the 20th century was probably inspired by Darwin's theory of the mutability of species, Nietzsche's critique of metaphysical anthropocentrism, and Freud's work on the unconscious. Several writers and thinkers have focused on the way animals and animality figure in Kafka's texts. As Shruti also pointed out in the introduction today, there are countless references to animals, human-animal comparisons, allusions to animals, fables, and animal motifs in his work. There are narratives in which a human has been transformed into an animal and vice versa. However, their representation has been predominantly regarded as a mere allegory of intrahuman matters, such as Judaism and Zionism, modern alienation, metaphysical concepts, and psychoanalytic ideas. Writing on the 10th anniversary of Kafka's death, Walter Benjamin, for example, suggests that the world of his ancestors, Kafka's ancestors, was as unfathomable as the world of realities was important for him, and we may be sure that, like the totem poles of primitive peoples, the world of ancestors took him down to the animals. Adorno claims that the flight through man and beyond into the non-human, that is Kafka's epic course. Deleuze and Guattari, who also Shruti quoted in the beginning, define Kafka's writing as essentially animalistic. Kafka's works revolve around an excavation of that which has been forgotten, and this process is closely linked to the animal figures in his texts. Animals are, for Kafka, repositories of the forgotten. This is a term used by Benjamin, in German, Behältnisse des Vergessenen, and he constantly tried to listen to the animals to hear that which has been forgotten. Also versuchte, den Tieren das Vergessene abzulauschen. Kafka does this by reanimalizing language, since, as Benjamin suggests, one's own animal body is the most forgotten other. Kafka's Zoopoetics is thus a poetics of the body, a reminder of one's own corporeality and hence of one's own animality. With this, we come to the question of what is Zoopoetics and how does it work in Kafka's texts? What are the various ways in which animals are written and write themselves? These questions are obviously intimately connected with questions of language and representation. Zoopoetics may thus be understood at the outset as the relationship between animality and poetic language. Jacques Derrida says the following about language, which also opens up the possibility of reading zoopoetically to find and follow the traces that the animal bodies produce and leave in Kafka's texts. I quote, "The idea according to which man is the only speaking being seems to me at once undisplaceable and highly problematic. Of course, if one defines language in such a way that it is reserved for what we call man, what is there to say? But if one reinscribes language in a network of possibilities that do not merely encompass it, but mark it irreducibly from the inside, everything changes. I am thinking in particular of the mark in general, of the trace, of iterability, of difference. These possibilities or necessities without which there would be no language are themselves not only human." Derrida writes in L'animal que donc je suis, the animal that therefore I am, about the difference between philosophical knowledge and poetic thinking, when he states that animals have long been objects of observation for philosophical and scientific texts, and it is poets who concern themselves with the fact that that means the animals, can observe us as well. All thinking begins for Derrida with the animal. I quote, "The animal looks at us and we are naked before it. Thinking perhaps begins there." All thinking is animal thinking in that sense, because it begins with the encounter with the animal. But this is precisely what Western philosophy has tried to forget or suppress. Poetic thinking, on the other hand, according to Derrida, is thinking about the animal as one who can look at us and address us. This affinity or connection between poetic thinking and animal thinking has produced what has been termed zoopoetics, a term first used by Derrida to refer precisely to Kafka's poetics. Zoopoetics can hence be understood as seeing and attentively listening to the animal, or as Kaori Driscoll puts it, listening otherwise to the animal, with the aim of recovering something that has been lost, forgotten, or repressed. Zoopoetics may hence be understood as a complex relationship between animality and poetic language. In other words, the entanglement of bodies and texts. Zoopoetics does not concern itself necessarily or merely with texts about animals, but rather with texts that are based on an engagement with animals and animality, be it human or non-human, and which reflect on questions of writing and representation via the animal. In writing about Kafka's Zoopoetics, Benjamin also claims that they are not the goal of Zoopoetics, but rather its medium which cannot be substituted. Sie sind wohl nicht das Ziel, aber ohne sie geht es nicht. In other words, Kafka's Poetics isn't Zoopoetics because he writes about animals, but because the animals in his texts serve particular poetic ends. Benjamin's claim leads to two kinds of misinterpretations commonly. One, that literary animals are to be read symbolically, metaphorically, or allegorically. And the second, that literary animals should not be read symbolically, metaphorically, or allegorically. A more nuanced interpretation of Benjamin's statement and of Zoopoetics on the whole is what literary animal studies has adopted since its inception in the 1980s, namely that it is okay to pay attention to the symbolic, metaphorical, or allegorical meanings embodied by animals in literary texts, as long as we do not read them merely as metaphors for the real and intended meaning. Reading zoopoetically counteracts the long-standing and dominant trend of reading animals out of literary texts, of forgetting them, or performing, in the words of Susan McHugh, the disappearing animal trick, which inevitably results in the human being left alone on the stage. Simultaneously, reading zoopoetically is not about attempting to reclaim the animals themselves, an approach which is fraught with the risk of ignoring or overlooking their specifically literary and poetic character. The non-human presences in Kafka's texts or in any literary texts are thus not merely metaphors, but they are also not merely themselves. Derrida comes to our rescue again with the term animaux, a word that sounds exactly like animaux, written with AUX at the end, which means animals in French, but spelled differently to end in mot, M-O-T, which means word in French. A zoopoetic reading thus engages with the animaux in literary texts and not with the animal as it would be in the real world. This animaux is, according to Donna Haraway, a material semiotic knot. The task of zoopoetics is to explore what lies between the two extremes, between the material and the semiotic, and how they are mutually imbricated and entangled. So the material and the semiotic, the body and the text, the animal and the word. A zoopoetic reading thus focuses on animality, non-human as well as human, by taking corporeality into account. Kafka's characters are typically located at the threshold between humanity and animality, fusing together human and non-human features. This leads to a questioning of the anthropological difference, the human-animal divide. This also opens up avenues of discussing whether it is possible to adopt the point of view of another animal, what we can know of the experience of being another animal, as well as how writing from the point of view of a non-human animal can open up alternate ways of considering what it is to be a human, bourgeois subject. Finally, it can enable us to rethink our understanding of human subjectivity and decenter anthropocentrism. The task of zoopoetics is not so much to blur or obliterate the boundary between humans and animals for the sake of positing a homogeneous continuity, but rather to show how there is a great multiplicity and heterogeneity inherent in these two categories. Derrida draws attention to the injustice done each time one uses the term the animal as an umbrella term. Moreover, the violence done to the animal begins, he says, with this pseudo concept of the animal, with the use of this word in the singular, as though all animals from the earthworm to the chimpanzee constituted a homogeneous set to which the human would be radically opposed. As a response to that first violence, Derrida invented the word animo, which when spoken has the plural animo, heard within the singular, recalling the extreme diversity of animals that the animal in the singular erases, and which, when written, because of the spelling, makes it plain that this word, the animal, is precisely only a word. The animal, what a word, says Derrida. The animal is a word, it is an appellation that men have instituted, a name they have given themselves the right and the authority to give to the living other. Elsewhere, he comes back to the animal as a singular when he says, confined within this catch-all concept, within this vast encampment of the animal, in this general singular, within the strict enclosure of this definite article, the animal, and not animals, as in a virgin forest, a zoo, a hunting or fishing ground, a paddock or an abattoir, a space of domestication, are all the living beings that man does not recognize as his fellows, his neighbors, or his brothers. And that is so in spite of the infinite space that separates the lizard from the dog, the protozoan from the dolphin, the shark from the lamb, the parrot from the chimpanzee, the camel from the eagle, the squirrel from the tiger, the elephant from the cat, the ant from the silkworm, and or the hedgehog from the echidna. This is an important distinction and one that Zoopoetics attempts to be attentive to. A great example to make the importance of this idea is, of course, Kafka's Metamorphoses, and we come to that now. It matters a lot to a zoopoetic reading of the narrative that Gregor sums up. The animality that the text invites readers to see and attentively listen to is of the corporeality of a bug that is, at the same time, Gregor sums up. The narrative begins post-metamorphosis, but there are references made to the Gregor of earlier times, which reveal much of his animality and corporeality as a human animal. We get to know about his exploitation at the hands of his family, the manner in which he has been deceived by his parents, the utterly joyless, exhausting, and exhausted existence he has led henceforth, and the sole reason why he has mattered to his family, namely because he is the breadwinner. This further reveals three possible ways of understanding the metamorphosis of Gregor Samsa into a bug. The first possibility is that the metamorphosis is merely a physical, external manifestation of the self-image that Samsa had of himself, namely that of an unloved, uncherished bug that can be crushed beneath anybody's feet in a perfectly matter-of-fact way. This reading is supported by the fact that Gregor does not express any surprise or shock at his metamorphosis when he wakes up one morning and finds himself in his metamorphosed form. The second possibility is that the metamorphosis is Gregor's subconscious revolt against his exploitation, since as a bug, he cannot possibly be of any economic value to his family. Not only can he not go to work, but he is not even of value as a companion animal or a pet. He is not even of value as meat, as a milch animal or a beast of burden. It is Samsa's way of being finally and irrevocably free. The third possibility is that metamorphosing into a bug is eventually not a bad thing. Because, in fact, the more it becomes obvious that the concern is well-being. As soon as this economic viability ends with the metamorphosis, the attentiveness comes to an end. Gregor, interestingly enough, retains certain human characteristics. He continues to think like a human being, understands human speech, and retains his aesthetic sense, as seen in the episode when he's moved by the sound of the violin played by his sister. Although the humans present in the room are engaged in conversation and inattentive to the music. Although he gradually loses the ability to speak like a human, this does not mean that he stops communicating. All the traces he leaves on the floor, in the dust in his room, because we know that after a while, the family stops cleaning his room, or on the walls when he crawls over them, are perhaps invisible to the eyes of his family members, but they are there. The non-human animal does leave traces, and the way we just saw in the statement by Jacques Derrida, this too is language, this too is communication. Written in 1912 and first published in 1915, this narrative has been read allegorically in a variety of ways. As a satire on petit bourgeois mores, as a Marxist critique of capitalist hierarchies, as a psychological analysis of alienation of the Oedipus complex, an example of the futility of Jewish assimilation into European society, a parable about the frailty of human empathy and solidarity, even an account of a homosexual coming out of the closet, and a tale of a family struggling with an afflicted family member. Tsvetan Todorov, however, takes the very multitude of allegorical interpretations and the fact that the text does not unequivocally favor any one of these interpretations as proof of the fact that it is actually not an allegory. Instead, it can be read as a text that exposes the construction of the human-animal binary and goes on to deconstruct this binary. In a zoopoetic reading of the text, Nama Harel takes the original meaning of the term Ungeziefer from Middle High German, where it meant unclean animal, unfit for sacrifice, reads it along with Agamben's notion of homo sacer, a person who is excluded from society and its law, may be killed by anybody, but may not be sacrificed as a part of religious rites, and connects it to the modern alienation from non-human animals and the total exclusion of non-human animals from social and political life. Seen from this perspective, the moment of Gregor Samsa's awakening in the form of Ungeziefer is the dawn of modern humanism. On two occasions, Gregor as Ungeziefer, and the word Ungeziefer has largely been translated either as vermin or bug in most English translations. Gregor attempts to cross the threshold of his room as well as the threshold of humanity when he tries to come out of the room to meet his family. But on both occasions, he is driven back beyond this threshold by his father brandishing a very significant weapon on each occasion. In the first instance, it is a newspaper, something connected very clearly to human language, to reading, reason. And in the second instance, it is apples, which are again a very potent symbol associated as they are with the acquisition of knowledge and the loss of innocence in the biblical story of mankind's original sin in the Garden of Eden. The alienation of humans from non-human animals also has a class angle to it in Kafka's text, as well as in the real world. Whereas Gregor's family is horrified and repulsed by the presence of the non-human, the vermin, the Ungeziefer in their midst, and their boarders are shocked, disgusted, and unwilling to continue living there, the family's cleaner is merely curious and not afraid or disgusted by him. I quote from the text, "For now, the cleaning woman was there. This old widow, who thanks to her strong, bony frame had probably survived the worst in a long life, was not really repelled by Gregor. Without being in the least inquisitive, she had once accidentally opened the door of Gregor's room, and at the sight of Gregor, she had remained standing, with her hands folded on her stomach, marveling. From that time on, she never failed to open the door a crack every morning and every evening, and peek in hurriedly at Gregor. In the beginning, she also used to call him over to her with words she probably considered friendly, like, "Come over here for a minute, you old dung beetle," or "Look at that old dung beetle." End of quote. This is in sharp contrast to the reaction of Gregor's mother, for example, who cries, "Help, for God's sake, help," on seeing him. The Samsa family, the chief clerk, the procurist, and the boarders are all bourgeois. The cleaner is a working class woman. This alienation of the bourgeoisie from the non-human is connected to the social division of labor, increasing urbanization, technological developments, and the increasing removal of non-human animals, except working animals, from human habitations. The progress of civilization went hand in hand with concealing all signs of the violence done to animals for human consumption. For example, as seen in the fact that slaughterhouses used to be within human dwellings or within human habitations, including within cities, but they were increasingly moved outside cities. And the rejection of all forms of cruelty by the upper and middle classes. This new sensitivity became widespread by the mid-18th century and led to the establishment of animal welfare organizations and the increasing practice of keeping companion animals. The job of killing and exploiting animals continued, only it was hidden from the upper and middle classes and carried out by the working class. Kafka's text reflects these attitudes. Gregor's middle-class family is estranged from the non-human. There is also a physical separation between human and non-human when Gregor is restricted to his room, and his family members, with the exception of his sister, refuse to go there. They react with revulsion to the sight of him, and eventually his sister too does not want to have anything to do with him anymore. It is in fact the same cleaner who disposes of Gregor's animalized body after his death, since his family does not want to see him, does not even want to know about how he was disposed of. With that, I'd like to raise the question of whether it is a metamorphosis or whether there are multiple metamorphoses happening in the text. More so than Gregor's metamorphosis, which happens even before the narrative begins, there are other metamorphoses in the text. Herr Samsa, Gregor's father, turns from an old, frail man who had relinquished his position as breadwinner to his son Gregor into a strong authoritarian figure who exercises biopolitical power over the animalized son, controlling all aspects of his life. But the real metamorphosis in the text is that of Gregor's sister, Greta. She gradually matures in the course of the text from the child who is able to connect with her animalized brother, in contrast to the alienated adults in the family, into a young woman who increasingly loses interest in him and equally becomes alienated from him. The clear correlation between her alienation from Gregor and her growing up reflects the process of alienation from the animal, which typically occurs in adolescence. Freud states, for example, in Totem and Taboo in 1913, children show no trace of the arrogance which urges adult civilized men to draw a hard and fast line between their own nature and that of all other animals. Children have no scruples over allowing animals to rank as their full equals. Uninhibited as they are in the avowal of their bodily needs, they no doubt feel themselves more akin to animals than to their elders, who may well be a puzzle to them. Adolescence becomes the phase in which an identity of the self as human is formed and consolidated by contrasting it with the non-human. Eventually, Greta becomes the very person to proclaim that the family must get rid of the Ungeziefer. She does not physically kill Gregor, but her words symbolically cause his death, as it happens immediately after he overhears her saying, "It has to go." Gregor metamorphoses from human to non-human in the text, but we also see Greta becoming inhumane. With the full rejection of animality when she says it has to go, her process of growing up and bourgeois socialization is completed. With the change from him to it, from er to s, the process of alienation is complete, and with nobody left to connect to, Gregor, the non-human, must disappear from the all-too-human world of his family. Another interesting feature here is that Gregor's metamorphosis is not yet complete when he wakes up at the beginning of the text. This is seen in the fact that his family immediately recognizes him as Gregor despite his vermin body, which reveals that he still retains some physical characteristics of his human form. So instead of assuming that Gregor the human has been driven out, chased away, or killed by the monstrous vermin, by the ungeheures Ungeziefer in his room, the family knows immediately that this ungeheures Ungeziefer is Gregor, which seems to suggest that the process of metamorphosis is still ongoing. Initially, there is a psychosocial split between the human mind and the animal body. Upon waking up as an ungeheures Ungeziefer, a monstrous vermin, Gregor's thoughts are not concerned with his metamorphosed body. As I mentioned earlier, also, he expresses no shock, no surprise, does not even think much about it. Instead, he's thinking of his job. I quote from the text, "He was lying on his back as hard as armor plate, and when he lifted his head a little, he saw his vaulted brown belly, sectioned by arc-shaped ribs, to whose dome the cover, about to slide completely, could barely cling. His many legs, pitifully thin compared with the size of the rest of him, were waving helplessly before his eyes. Oh God," he thought, "what a grueling job I've picked, day in, day out, on the road." Soon, however, there is a gradual change, and Gregor starts becoming adept at operating his new body. Instead of feeling pain and suffering, and we know that initially it was painful for him to be in this new body, he starts deriving joy and satisfaction from his new animal corporeality. I quote from the text, "For the first time that morning, he had a feeling of physical well-being. His little legs were on firm ground. They obeyed him completely, as he noted, to his joy." End of quote. He learns to live with this body, and the corporal transformation is revealed to be an ongoing process. For example, when his sight deteriorates, his thoughts no longer dwell on his earlier human existence, and he starts enjoying experiences which are appropriate to his present non-human status. I quote, "He adopted the habit of crawling crisscross over the walls and the ceiling. He especially liked hanging from the ceiling. It was completely different from lying on the floor. One could breathe more freely. A faint swinging sensation went through the body. End of quote. Gradually, his human psyche adjusts to his corporeal transformation, and with this process, it becomes clear that Gregor is not a human trapped in a non-human body, but rather a humanimal hybrid, a liminal creature whose mental and physical existence contains human and non-human features. Unlike in traditional metamorphosis narratives, Gregor breaks down the species barrier since he does not cross over from one side to the other. Instead, he is situated on the threshold between the two domains. With this in-betweenness, humanimal Gregor Samsa transgresses the human-animal barrier. The text also transgresses several conventions of traditional metamorphosis narratives. The formula, for example, of sin, punishment, redemption, which is found in traditional metamorphosis narratives, is absent here. There is no sin for which Gregor could be punished. In fact, he's always been a model son and brother. His metamorphosis is presented as spontaneous and not caused by any authority, supernatural or otherwise. And he is not redeemed by a process of counter-metamorphosis and regaining his human form. In fact, the metamorphosis into a non-human animal is linked to the moment of anagnorisis in the text. Gregor learns about the true nature of his family members and their financial affairs only after he has turned into a monstrous vermin. Also, it affords him a freedom which he has hitherto never had. He is freed from the demands of his exhausting job and can spend his time crisscrossing the walls of his room instead. The text also departs from the traditional association made between humans and humaneness and animals and brutality. The non-human in this text is the most gentle, sensitive, and moral of all the characters in the narrative. Because of the manner in which the story is narrated from his perspective and his moral superiority to the others, readers feel empathy for a creature that normally in the real world does not arouse any empathy. Lastly, it is worth noting that the transformation of Gregor Samsa into a bug or vermin, though it appears initially as a spontaneous transformation, is actually a societally inflicted metamorphosis into vermin. It is the alienating family and their response to the metamorphosis that designates Gregor as vermin, as S instead of ear. Elias Canetti too shares this view. I quote, "Instead of a son who feeds and supports the family, all of a sudden there is an insect. This transformation exposes him inescapably to humiliation. An entire family feels provoked to inflict it actively. Hesitantly, the humiliation begins. Time is allowed for its expansion and intensification. Gradually, all the characters, almost helplessly and against their will, participate in it. They recapitulate the act that is given at the outset. It is the family itself that transforms Gregor Samsa irretrievably into an insect. What was an insect becomes, in the social context, vermin. In this way, animal existence is presented not merely as a biological state, but rather as a fusion of biological and social existence. With that, I come to the second text that I want to discuss today, a report to an academy, ein Bericht für eine Akademie. Kafka's 1917 short story, A Report to an Academy, centers on Red Peter, in German Rotpeter, an ape captured in Africa and transported to Europe. To escape the grim fate awaiting him, Red Peter resolved to become human. at first by imitating the people around him, and later through a systematic study of humans. The entire story is Red Peter's monologue delivered to the members of the Academy who invited him to report on his former life as an ape. Like all of Kafka's animal stories, this one too has been largely read allegorically. Red Peter's transformation has been perceived first and foremost as an allegory for attempts at assimilation by European Jews. Other common allegorical readings of the story deal with European colonialism in Africa, the human condition, as well as questions of mimesis in art. Zoopoetically, the text is better understood if one reads it in conjunction with the history of the modern zoo and animal circuses in 19th and 20th century Europe, when the wild animal trading companies established the counter narrative that zoos were a sanctuary, a safe place for wild animals where they could be better off than in the wild, and that animal circuses used humane, positive reinforcement methods in training wild animals to perform in circuses. Zoo enclosures around this time stopped looking like cages and seemed to be open structures since they were surrounded by a moat in most cases. But this was an even more insidious form of captivity since it was not even visible. These changes came about in conjunction with the upper and middle class public's increasing unease with visible violence, which I referred to in the last instance, in the instance of the last text too. In fact, the traces of cruelty and violence involved in capturing and training wild animals did not disappear. They were merely concealed from the public eye. When Red Peter lowers his pants in the text to reveal the scar left behind by the bullet shot at him when he was captured, he makes the carefully concealed violence become visible, thereby troubling the public, which does not want its entertainment tainted by such traces of violence and their own moral culpability in it. Reacts by directing its and a sudden awareness of shame and the need to clothe themselves. In this sense, this is also the moment of becoming human. Red Peter in the text is looking for a way out. He's looking for an ausweg. This isn't the same as freedom, for there cannot be any freedom for the non-human. Deprived of the freedom he had in the state of nature, yet also denied the protection under the Hobbesian social contract in the civil world, Red Peter has the worst of both worlds and belongs to neither of them. Simultaneously captured inside and outside the force of law. No longer in the state of nature, yet without an option of becoming a member of civil society and being protected reflects on his situation while on board, is stuck between the two states. He realizes that as an ape, he can neither return to the state of nature nor enter the social contract. He also realizes he cannot exist outside both states, so he chooses the only way out, the only option left to him, which is to stop being an ape. Since this may perhaps allow him to enter. His search for a way out is thus also a search for a way into a protective order of the human species. This makes the text a very unusual metamorphosis narrative. Here, unlike in usual narratives, the metamorphosis happens from non-human to human. As a humanized ape, Red Peter is situated at the threshold of humanity, but even before his humanization as a mere ape, Red Peter was literally a human ape, in German ein Menschenaffe. Interestingly, Red Peter retains the physical appearance of an ape, and yet he is still perceived by all as the metamorphosis from ape to human, and the reason behind it, namely the need to survive, places it in close proximity to Darwin's theory of evolution. It is a process of adaptation. At the same time, this evolution is not depicted as a positive development. Red Peter learns how to spit, smoke, and drink, and claims ironically that he has reached the average cultural level of a European. Becoming human in this version requires neither rational thinking nor moral virtues. In this way, the hierarchical separation of humans from apes is undermined and the humanist ethos satirized. In other words, Red Peter's change from ape to human is presented as a regression from a higher to a lower form of life. In addition, the species transition here is not a corporeal transformation, but purely a matter of social construction. In other words, of species performativity. To paraphrase Judith Butler, species isn't something that one is, but rather something one does. Species identity in a report to an academy is a cultural code based on imitation, having no inherent essence. Hence, it can be disrupted, undermined, resisted, and troubled. Furthermore, species identity is connected to spitting, drinking, and smoking, and speaking is only briefly mentioned. Although the ability to speak and use language has always been at the cornerstone of human exceptionalism. This is also noticeable in the case of the animalized humans in the text. The sailors on the ship who hardly ever speak, but only use their mouths to eat, smoke, and spit. The trapeze artists in the circus too seem to Red Peter to perform ape-like acts and are hence animalized in their behavior. The species transition in a report to an academy is thus bidirectional. It works in both directions, which makes it even more radical than the transition in Metamorphoses. In this way, the dominant human-animal binary as a natural border between human and non-human is displaced and replaced with a species fluidity. The transition that Red Peter undergoes is also a sign of his agency as a non-human animal. Red Peter decides to become non-human, to stop being, decides to become human, to stop being non-human, since that is the only way to survive. It is not a spontaneous transition, a preternatural metamorphosis, but more like putting on a mask. I quote from the text, "I had no way out, but had to provide myself with one, for I could not live without it. Always up against the wall of this crate, I would inevitably have croaked. But at Hagenbeck, apes belong up against the wall. Well, so I stopped being an ape." It's interesting here also that the name Hagenbeck is invoked, because there was in fact a major trading company that captured wild animals from Africa and brought them to Europe and sold them to zoos as well as circuses, and which profited a lot around this time. And it was run by someone called Carl Hagenbeck. And the company was called Hagen, the real world. But that makes us see exactly what he's talking about in a way. The statement, I stopped being an ape is significant because at this stage, Red Peter does not say, I became human. He finds himself in a liminal humanimal zone between human and non-human, no more an ape, yet not human either, but a hybridized being between the oppressed non-human and the human oppressor. That he has learned to imitate exploitative human behavior in order to survive is also seen in his behavior to the female chimpanzee, to whom he is cold. And the next text that we will be talking about is Forschung eines Hundes, Investigations of a Dog, a short story with a canine narrator, which was written in 1922 and first published posthumously in 1931. The narrator occupies himself with complex metaphysical inquiries, yet he is a dog, and his point of view is as caninocentric as the human point of view is anthropocentric. Through his performance of caninocentric investigations, the canine narrator holds up a mirror to anthropocentrism and speciesism. The dog has long been portrayed in literature either as man's loyal companion or as a submissive, despicable, homeless creature. Harold discusses how Kafka's dog figures depart from the canine archetype of the faithful dog that abounds in literary tradition. They are not portrayed by Kafka positively as mankind's best friend, but rather negatively as submissive and despicable, as objects of humiliation. For example, in Kafka's texts, Blumfeld and Älterer Junggeselle, Ein Leben and Verlockung im Dorf. These are qualities which derive from their domestication, de-animalization, and loss of wildness. Because of this domestication, dogs are liminal creatures that exist on the threshold between nature and civilization. And their liminal status arouses ambivalent recognized species other than dogs. The world consists for him of dogs and non-dogs. This umbrella term of non-dogs is comparable to Derrida's The Animal. Furthermore, the narrator's inability to comprehend certain things he sees seems at first glance to have a comic effect. For example, when he doesn't understand why a group of 7 acrobatic dogs are walking on their hind legs, the dogs are in a circus, and the canine narrator does not understand why they are walking on their hind legs, what they are afraid of, or why certain dogs float in the air, never coming down to the ground and using their legs. Similarly, food falling from the sky is an enigma for the canine narrator. The human reader of the text, however, knows that the dogs on their hind legs are performing in a circus, that they are afraid of their trainer, and that the floating dogs are in fact lap dogs. The food is not falling from the sky, but is dropped or thrown to the dogs by a human being. A second, more careful glance reveals, however, that the comic effect is in fact a defamiliarizing effect, which causes the reader to pause and re-examine and question issues taken for granted. In the case of the inverted power relations between humans and other animals, it challenges anthropocentric views of human superiority over other species. Confronted with the canine narrator's incomprehension of these acts, the human reader too acquires a new perspective and becomes able to see the unnaturalness and cruelty inherent in compelling the other canines in the text to behave against their nature. Similarly, the laughter provoked by the canine narrator's caninocentric worldview, in which dogs are superior to all non-dogs, that is, all other species, soon makes way for a critical re-evaluation of the anthropocentric worldview in which the human is held to be superior to all other species. In this way, Investigations of a Dog performs a deconstruction of the speciesist boundary by inverting the interspecies power relations. The protagonist of the story is neither a paragon of faithfulness, nor despicable, nor submissive. Since all three paradigms hinge on the dependence of dogs on humans. The narrator of Investigations of a Dog seems, on the other hand, not to be dependent on people, yet he is also not a stray dog and does not live, so to speak, a dog's life in the figurative sense. In fact, humans are completely absent from his inquiry as he deals exclusively with canine community. Members of all other species are only briefly mentioned as one insignificant and inferior unit of non-dogs. From the standpoint of the narrator, canine superiority is obvious, it's self-evident. He does not even refer to the possibility that human beings ever had or may have a superior status. By presenting dogs as the dominant species who rule over other species due to their technological and intellectual superiority, Investigations of a Dog radically inverses the actual interspecies power relations. However, it does not present an alternative extratextual universe where the interspecies power relations are inverted. The inversion stems actually from the limitations of the canine narrator's consciousness, its canine consciousness, and his inability to perceive the role of human beings as the missing link in his investigations. A link which, on the other hand, is not missing for the human readers. While the story does not actually undermine the interspecies power relations, it does undercut speciesism and the very notion of species superiority. The narrator's caninocentrism can, in fact, be construed as a satire or parody of anthropocentrism and human exceptionalism. The dog's speciesist fallacy within the diegetic world exposes the fundamental speciesist fallacy of human beings in the real world as well. The fact that the canine narrator in the text does not see humans at all reminds us also of the fact or of the way in which we do not see animals at all in our world, or how looking at the animal. Investigations of a Dog thus inverts the observer-observed relations between human and non-human animals, reminding us that we can also be observed or overlooked by them. When observed by a non-human animal, we too are just another species and just as invisible, possibly, as they are to us. And with that, we come to the last part, which I call Kafka's Mice, in which we will be talking about Josephine, the singer, or the mouse people, and Kleine Fabel, a little fable. Josephine, the singer, or the mouse people, is Kafka's last story, which he wrote in 1924, just a few months before his death. The story centers on the relationship between the singer Josephine and the community where she lives. This is a relationship of admiration and contempt, of anxiety and abandonment. It has largely been read allegorically as a text about art, on the belief that Kafka subversively uses the anti-Semitic stereotype of the Jewish people as the mouse people in this text. Mice also appear in two other texts by Kafka. We will be referring to one of them, namely A Little Fable. Talking about A Little Fable, the title of the text seems to indicate that the mouse in it is an allegorical mouse, since anthropomorphized talking animals are a staple of fables. However, several critics have pointed out that Kafka himself did not give his text this title. It is Max Brod who chose this title and published the text after Kafka's death. Hence, there is nothing to indicate that Kafka considered this piece a fable. If one nevertheless reads it as a fable, cat and mouse obviously symbolize certain human qualities and represent power and weakness, hunter and hunter, or oppressor and oppressed. However, unlike traditional fables, Kleine Fabel does not seem to have an explicit moral or lesson for the reader. What it does seem to convey, though, is an ethical truth or message. The depiction of a tiny, feeble, powerless creature trapped in a hopeless situation, in an inevitable existential predicament, since regardless of which route she chooses, she's bound to get hurt. This text reflects an ethical truth, a very Kafkaesque Weltanschauung, in line with Kafka's other works. Characterization of non-human animals in fables does not necessarily conflict with their real nature. In fact, their size, anatomy, and functions in the ecological system are the same in the diegetic and real worlds. In A Little Fable, Kafka uses the convention of fables, in which the anthropomorphized speaking animals still possess some of the authentic characteristics of their species. The description of the mouse as a tiny, weak, helpless, and constantly threatened creature corresponds to the life of mice in the extra-diegetic world. The description of the mouse's death is very concise and bereft of emotion. It just says in the text, I quote, said the cat and devoured it. The mouse here is not characterized as an individual with specific characteristics or as representative of a typical distinct group. The description is such that the reader does not see the mouse as significant, but only as a means of conveying a message. The mouse and her experience are thus reduced to intrahuman concerns. An empathetic yet realistic representation of mice is rare not only in Kafka's work, but in literature overall. Fictional mice seem to be, for the most part, anthropomorphized and allegorized. Unlike companion animals with whom humans are familiar, but also unlike wild animals who intrigue us and evoke reverence, mice are considered vermin and evoke disgust, fear, and revulsion. In Josephine, the Singer, or the Mouse People, there is no direct statement to clearly indicate that the characters are in fact mice, nor is there any direct statement to clearly indicate that they are in fact humans. Species identity is masked in this text in contrast to the specific indication of the character's biological species in Kafka's other texts like Report to an Academy, Jackals and Arabs, Researches of a Dog, and A Crossbreed, as well as many other shorter works such as A Little Fable, The Vulture, The Tiger, and Leopards in the Temple. It contains indications that the creatures might be mice, but all of these indications are inconclusive. In fact, apart from the title, the word mouse appears only once, and it is used there figuratively or metaphorically. It appears in conjunction with describing the silence of Josephine's audience. I quote, "But her audience does not speak. We are as quiet as mice." The mice in this construction, as quiet as mice, or in the original German, Mäuschen still, functions only as a figure of speech without being present. The only element in the text which could perhaps conclusively be read, or which has often been conclusively read as non-human, is the character's fur, pelts, such as in the sentence, I quote, "Many who are present do not bother to look up, instead of pressing their faces into the fur of their neighbors." However, even this is eventually inconclusive, since fur could refer to the hairy skin of several mammals, but it could also imply clothing made of fur and worn by humans, as in a fur coat or jacket. And in fact, Kafka has often used the word pelz to denote a pelz mantle or something of the sort. The neighbors can thus be non-human or human. Havel also points out that the word Volk in das Volk der Mäuse is also ambiguous. It can denote people, a human community, or even a non-human species that has social species structures similar to those of humans, such as ants, because we have the word Ameisenvolk, termites, Termitenvolk, and bees, Bienenvolk. However, the term Mäusevolk is not used in German. Elsewhere in the text, the narrator indicates that if one individual stood in the place of the people here, you could imagine that all this time he had given into Josephine with a continually burning desire to stop once and for all being so indulgent. End of quote. In the original German, this individual in the English translation is defined as a man. So M-A-N-N, man. Again, the use of man or man seems to support the hypothesis that this is a story about a human community, not a mouse community, even at the literal level of the story. And yet it needs to be noted that the sentence does not refer to any concrete person, since the grammatical mode of the phrase is conjunctive zwei, an unreal condition, if one individual stood or were to stand, which is merely hypothetical. And this use of the conjunctive weakens the effect of the statement, so that the ambiguity is maintained. In addition, references to Josephine's body mention certain organs which humans have, but mice do not, such as arms, neck, and lips, as well as the fact that Josephine is described as standing upright with her arms held hanging by her sides. These anthropomorphic anomalies raise questions about her biological nature and mask her species identity. Another ambiguous element is the word used to denote the voice produced by mice in the text. In the original German, the word used is pfeifen, which in English has been translated as whistling or piping, instead of piepsen, squeaking, which is more commonly used to describe the sound produced by mice. And yet, pfeifen is not an appropriate term to denote human singing or chanting either. In this way, the auditory element, the word pfeifen, too maintains the ambiguity about the biological identity of Josephine and the other characters in the story and masks their species. While on the topic of the sounds made by mice, Cowrie Driscoll shows in his wonderful article, An Unheard Inhuman Music, Narrative Voice, and the Question of the Animal in Kafka's Josephine, the Singer, or the Mouse Folk, how neuroscience has determined that male mice sing syntactically complex songs to attract females, and that these songs vary according to social context, just like the songs of songbirds. In fact, female mice sing as well. However, unlike birds, most mice sing at ultrasonic frequencies, because of which their songs are inaudible to human ears. In fact, there had even been reports of singing mice before the time when Kafka wrote about Josephine. Alfred Brehm describes the phenomenon in detail in his work Life of Animals, Brehm's Tierleben, published in the 1860s, and there is ample evidence that Kafka was well acquainted with this work and therefore knew about the fact that mice can sing and do sing, or that some individual mice sing at a pitch which is discernible for humans. This again strengthens the ambiguity in the text. Singing cannot be regarded anymore as a solely human capability, which mice lack, which would have suggested that Josephine and the other characters are human, since Josephine can sing. The fact that Josephine and the others are not sufficiently shown as mice and seem like humans seems to support the view that this text is a fable and the characters are to be read allegorically. But for a fable to work as a fable, the anthropomorphized animals must retain some basic physiological and biological characteristics of their species. Whereas here, the species identity of the characters is unclear even at the literal level of the text. What is significant, though, is the fact that mice are weak, constantly threatened creatures, and the narrator states the following about the community in the text. Our enemies too numerous, the dangers that confront us on all sides are incalculable. We cannot shelter our children from the struggle for existence, and if we did so, it would mean their premature end. This statement can be read both ways, as applicable to the community of mice who are constantly threatened with extermination since they are seen as vermin, and to vulnerable, marginalized human communities as well. The ambiguity maintained in the text hence performs not only a species masking, but also a species fluidity, which enables both interpretations of the statement. The characters can be seen as human-like mice or mice-like humans. By being of uncertain status, they challenge species boundaries. They do not have a dual nature in this text, unlike in some of the other Kafka texts. Instead, it is their representation which is ambiguous, so that the reader cannot fix them on either side of the human-animal divide. In this way, this text too blurs the anthropocentric contradistinction between human and non-human animals. To sum up, we started out by I started out by proposing that the animals in Kafka's texts are liminal creatures, since they are located on the threshold between humanity and animality, and so they can be seen to inhabit a human-animal zone where one is not clearly differentiated from the other, where one cannot be clearly differentiated from the other. We moved on to talk about what is zoopoetics, what it aims to do, and what it is not about. And in a third step, we went on to carry out a zoopoetic reading of certain texts by Franz Kafka, where we looked at the human-animal hybrid in Die Verwandlung and saw how in this text, species is not just biological, but primarily it is socially constructive, which obviously leads to the conclusion that if species is constructed, it can also be deconstructed. Next, we looked at how species transition and species fluidity are presented and how they happen in Ein Bericht für eine Akademie. And we saw how species is not what one is, but what one does. And therefore, it is a question of species performativity, not something that is inherent, but something which is performed and therefore can again be deconstructed. In the third case, looking at Forschungen eines Hundes, we talked about how the caninocentrism and the inversion of interspecies power relations presented in this text enables us to rethink anthropocentrism and the existing interspecies power relations in the world we inhabit. And in the last instance, where we looked at Kafka's mice, we saw how ambiguity in representation, so that it is unclear whether Josephine and the others are mice or humans, functions here as a means to blur the species barrier and mask species identity. This again enables a rethinking of anthropological difference by showing that vulnerability and precarity are a part both of the non-human as well as human experience. I hope that this was of some use to those of you who are here. Thank you very much for your time.
So I think, thank you so much, Anu. We could actually all clap together. If we were here, we would have not stopped clapping. It was really, really very fresh. It was enlightening. It was a new perspective for many of us here. And I think we thoroughly understood and enjoyed what you were saying. I mean, you are a brilliant speaker. We all know that. I have known you for a long time already. And I'm sure all our students here and colleagues who have joined us today would also see that. So I don't think I need to sum up any of the points. You've done that brilliantly anyway. I'd like to open the floor for questions and observations. I'm sure there are many things that people want to share, ideas. So please, yes, Milia. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I would just like to pose one question. When Kafka mixes the entire between non-animals and non-human animals and human qualities in his mixture of creatures, we see that according to him, evolution would be moving from the human to the animal, which is opposite from the anthrocentric view, that is, evolution is moving from animal to human. So does Kafka do this in order to give autonomy back to the animal, or is it for us readers to see this creature as a very as not as a specified person, but as somebody who is very not specified? Please let me know if my question was very vague.
Yes, I think I understand what you mean. And if you find that my answer does not address what you wanted to know, then please tell me and I will try to ask you to rephrase it. No? The way I see it, Milia, Kafka's animals never end up on this or the other side, you know, and that is the whole idea of liminality. So there seems to be a movement, there is a movement because they move out of the zone in which they were. And however, they do not go across to the other side. So they are always situated somewhere in between. So it's not yet, I mean, it's a kind of an evolutionary process because evolution is ongoing, but it is not a process which has reached a conclusive stage yet, where one can say, yes, this is it, this is what was to result, and this has resulted, and these are the contours of the new being that has emerged. Earlier, he was an ape, if you think of Rothpeter. Rothpeter says he decides not to be an ape anymore. And he's referred to as the former ape by the members of the academy. But he has not exactly become a human, you know. He is on the way to becoming a human, but we see that his attempt of becoming human is one of imitating what he sees humans doing, spitting, smoking, drinking alcohol, being nasty to the female chimpanzee. Yeah. So he retains his physical ape body, he retains his apeness, but he tries to perform humanity or humanness in order to be accepted onto the other side. But actually, he never crosses over to the other side. That at least is how I see Kafka's animals. I hope, does that clear something for you?
Thank you so much, Professor. That does answer my question.
So, yes, Ankur, please.
Thank you very much for this session, Professor. It feels as if there was just a lot more, and it had to be edited for the constraint of the time. But anyway, I'll get to try to frame my convoluted question about a couple of things. In fact, one, in an edited volume called Modernism and Phenomenology from this author called Ariane Mildenberg, there is a chapter on Samsa and the text Metamorphoses, and there is a citation which sort of talks about this condition of Gregor Samsa being the Husserlian null punct, a 0 point for all perception and orientation as a phenomenological onlooker. And the condition that this character now does not add anything to world constitution. And I add to that is that perhaps because it has to go back to self-constitution, that this character cannot constitute in the world anymore, right? It's essentially what I'm trying to get at is the question of inner life, right? And through these processes of metamorphosis, do these characters have an inner life, and not essentially about let's say the character Gregor Samsa, but also in the context of the discipline and the methodology to sort of try to unpack the subjectivity and these conditions of these characters that you introduced us to. And then another and this could be just maybe a question of the use of the phrase and the term. I'm thinking of this text by UC Parika called Insect Media and Archaeology of Animals and Technology. First, of course, I mean, the name of the text itself, leaves me to a lot of confusion. It says insect media, and then it says an archaeology of animals and technology. My question is that, in the context of speciation and let's say just the, let's say complications around the nomenclature, whether we should see vermin as an insect or as an animal, does that also let's say raises questions or makes difference in how we understand cognition for these characters, right? How are they sort of perceiving the world and all? And interestingly, a lot of your discussion that was sort of surrounded, it had a lot of this critique of the Darwinian model of evolution, right? That you always advance from a less, let's say, advanced species to a more advanced species, which in this case should be human. And I was trying to read this text called Creative Evolution from Henri Bergson. And I was thinking that how in Kafka's case that the organism is thrown in a synthetic atmosphere with little worry for natural habitation. This is completely opposite to Bergson's inquiry for a theory of how variation happens in the first place. So Bergson is indeed critiquing the Darwinian model, which does not explain that how this variation happened. It just says that this is species A, this is species B, and it's a typological model of referring to species. And then we distinguish and differentiate these types, right? That this is a human type and this is a type, let's say, of the vermin, which is supposed to, sort of fall into the category of the animals. So what happens in between, as you said, right? How this variation occurred, right? Which is also the absurdity in the case of Gregor Samsa, that nobody really, let's say there isn't enough time spent on thinking about, let's say, discussing the shock that should I even believe that this happened, right? And so do we as readers sort of tend to believe that, okay, this transformation has happened, and then we go on to read the rest of the story, even believing this absurdity and not maybe questioning it enough, right? And this again is tied to my question of inner life, that how do we study inner life in animals, right? Their, let's say, somatosensory apparatuses and cognition, and then how, of course, the text is trying to bring the focus back to body and corporeality being the center of, let's say, meaning making, and sort of reperceiving, reconceptualizing the world, the surrounding and everything, right? So it indeed is not a full transformation, because there is a continuous conflict between judgment and perception, that even though he has a body of a vermin, he's still thinking with the mind of the human, right? So the judgment is of the human, and the cognition, the somatosensory cognition, is with the mind of the, with the body of the vermin. And then a question which I was maybe
please let
just
Anu answer the first three questions, and then
just last edition, because I just can't put these things into sequence. I know. Just one more question around language, right? That even in Benjamin's text that you mentioned there, this in the English translation specifically of the Metamorphoses, this word screeches keeps appearing again and again. That the sounds that Samsa is making, it's translated as screeches, and then there is a lot of literature around gestural theory in Kafka, right? My question about in this context is about this condition of paralysis of processes of language acquisition that Kafka's characters have been put into. It's almost a challenge. Okay, how do you talk now, and how would you understand now? Which is again, Samsa is constantly suffering through. Again, I'm trying all these things to make a question of inner life, right? Then that's my, you know, well formulated question. But thank you for your talk.
Thank you, Ankur. That was quite a lot, and I will try to take them up one by one, if not necessarily in the same order in which you post them, because I can also see that they are interconnected. And I will try to answer them to the best of my ability, but I also welcome others who are present here at the session to please pitch in and add things which are beyond my capabilities, because I'm sure that there's a lot that can be said on this. The thing that I would like to start out with is the question that you raised about how can we know what it is to be an animal? How can we know about the inner life of the animal, of the non-human animal, be it Gregor Samsa in the text, be it any of the other characters that we have in Kafka's texts or in other literary texts, but also for that matter in the real world. And my short answer to that would be that we can never know with absolute certainty. But we can also never know with absolute certainty what it is like to be Ankur or to be Anu or to be any of the others amongst us, among the humans. We depend on human speech and reports from one another for what we call knowledge about each other. But from the animals, there are signs, there are traces, there are knowledge about them will always be limited, but that is also not necessarily a big problem. We do not have to know what it is to be an animal. What we can do, and what literary animal theory is doing a lot nowadays since the last 10, 12 years, is being extremely interdisciplinary about it. So literary theory does not approach Kafka's animals, for example, anymore through a purely literary theory lens, but people integrate approaches which come from neurosciences, for example, as I tried to show through Kauri Vine's article about, Kauri Driscoll's article about Josephine and the fact that mice can sing, whereby most of us would assume, no, they just speak, they don't sing. But neuroscience has now shown us, and this has been written about, and people have actually made the connection with Josephine to say, oh, that makes us read this story in a new way. Because so far we kind of thought, yeah, well, mice can't sing, so this is a singing mouse. Is it a mouse überhaupt? But now, now that you know, now that science tells you that there is such a thing as mice singing, it makes you rethink certain things. Without being able to know with 100% certainty, do they have an inner life? Do they have, a state, an inner state at the moment when they are transitioning, or otherwise when they are on this side or in the process of transition? I would say yes. As far as one can see in the text, there is a consciousness that is attached to the state of liminality. And there is a certain amount of access that the text gives us to the inner life of the animal. We can expand as we learn more, but yes, it will probably never be complete. There is also an interesting study which is something on the lines of how is it to be a bat, or what is it to be a bat, something of the sort, which engages precisely with this question. How can you know the inner life of the bat? How can you put yourself in the bat's shoes to write about the bat, given the fact that the bat can't speak to you in ways that are legible or comprehensible for you? But then a certain amount of empathetic approach, a certain amount of scientific approach can enable a certain kind of definitely. The other question where you asked about evolution and about the question of whether we should see vermin as animals or insects, and you had a couple of other points around that. makes me think about the whole thing also of naming or of taxonomy, which I would tend to connect also to a very anthropocentric practice of naming, of organizing beings into into the whole taxonomical order of saying this is a part of this and this is under that category, etc., etc. Kafka's text presents, the Metamorphoses, for example, presents das Ungeheure Ungeziefer. And I don't think it is an accident that Kafka does not use a particular, a taxonomic sort of description of which bug it is. He could have done that, but he consistently refused to do that. In fact, he refused to have any illustration done for the cover of the book when it was published, because he did not want to specify which bug it is. Various English translations have translated it as bug or vermin, as we talked about also. But in itself, the description of the creature presented in the text is also extremely inconclusive, because it does not resemble any known insect. It has certain aspects of one, certain others of another one, but all of them taken together cannot be conclusively, believed to lead to the assumption that Gregor Samsa has turned into this or the other creature. It's left purposely open, I would say, to invite the reader to read into it the way he or she likes, but also to because it fits in really well with Kafka's overall theme of ambiguity. And also because it breaks down the barriers or the borders between beings, between is it an animal, is it an insect, is it an insect with so many legs or another kind of legs, is it an insect with a fused thorax and head, or is it something else? It's left open, because putting creatures in categories would probably, in this worldview of Kafka, also be a sort of infliction of violence. And again, something that would reinforce that there are disorders. I hope that this helps you to some extent, but please, if anybody else in the audience would like to respond more fully to the questions, please do go ahead.
Professor Dengle, Rosie, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you so much, Anu. It was absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed every moment of it, and also the questions. I mean, I would like to first of all find out, what it means to be human, and then ask myself whether it is possible for me to understand what's going on in the mind, in the consciousness of an animal, And so, I mean, I see a certain anthropocentric arrogance in this when I say that, how do I put myself in the position of an animal, whereas I myself do, and I think that is perhaps, Shruti is here, Nietzsche, and so on and so forth, basically accepting the fact that I may not be a complete human being, and therefore I do not have perhaps the authority, the right to ask a question like this. The only question that I can ask myself is perhaps who am I? I mean, how does it? How did it happen? How did this birth and so on, this life happen, etc. The second thing about the Metamorphoses, I mean, I really enjoyed that. The other thing, I mean, if I read Kafka and different texts, the theological interpretation, the idea of enlightenment, wanting to, sort of become the Übermensch, transcending the limitations of humanity and becoming someone which is greater, and so on and so forth. And then the opposite of that, becoming an Ungeziefer. are things which have to be understood perhaps in that context as well. That is also a context which is which to me is very important. I think I'll dwell on it a little in my whatever presentation in May, but anyway. So I mean, why Gibbs auf? I mean, why who's telling whom to let go of what? Who's letting go of what? Are questions which to me are very important, and I think any effort to answer these questions, to attempt to answer these questions in any affirmative or positive manner, meets with disaster, with frustration in Kafka. So how do I move from there? How do I go from there? Is perhaps something which I would like to ask myself.
Rosie?
No, Anu gave a very rigorous presentation. I was I would only add one point to it that, in fact, I was thinking about it when she was presenting that such creatures have always been present in, folk tales or in mythology, where, some time back, I went to Crafts Museum in Delhi, and they have these statues, half human, half animal. The head might be of a horse and the body might be human, or, so many examples are there. We have the Sphinx, of course, lion's body, no, lion's face, I think, and the body, or the other way around. So this motive of, mixing of animal features and human features, physical or even other features, this has been always there. But what Kafka does is he kind of brings it to 20th century. So he, this modern writing, it is, it's very, he mixes categories. It is neither purely fantastic literature, it is neither purely realistic literature. So he, I would say his contribution is also in terms of structure. Content can be interpreted in many ways, but also in terms of, I think, form, structure. He presents a new way of writing, which also, I think later on it was followed by Günter Grass and even this magic realism and all these things. They, it has been there in 20th century. It's not really disappeared, but I think he was the first one who kind of got Germany or German literature out of realism and naturalism, and then more symbolism, more existentialism, and more a new form of writing, I would say. And that is where I would place Kafka with all his animal stories. He kind of bit of mythology. He takes from so many sources. Like last time there was the story of the Greek, the horse of Alexander. So all these Greek motives, or Roman motives, or whichever motives from mythology, from history, from whatever, and it's very modern also at the same time. So, and the same is for animal stories, I would say. Well, very interesting. Thank you.
Well, I find
Thank
the
you so
very
much.
inclusion of animals to such an extent in his works, and the way he presents them, and the kind of autonomy he gives his animal figures, already a very, very modern approach, because one finds so much of literature in which it's so exclusively human and humanist that this at the turn of the century, well, in the early years of the 20th century, is very refreshing. And like you said, it's a big break in the German literary tradition, and therefore also extremely significant.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. I would take a very important point that from Professor Dengle about one side of viewing it, who am I? And on the other hand, even Rosie speaking about how about the different sources. You know, when you were talking about Josephine, for example, and the fact that it says Pfeifen there, yeah, I was I've always been reminded, and the moment I was reading Josephine for the first time, I was reminded of the Rattenfänger von Hamelin, the Pied Piper of Hamelin. I'm sure you all know about that story. Yeah, so it's a fairy tale, and we know about it, and I think it's a direct allusion to that story. You know, and one could actually then also see about how singing, music plays an important role there, and how the Pied Piper then actually almost hypnotizes the mice and takes them out. That's the story. And then not only the mice, but on being cheated by the king and not getting his the money that was promised to him, he actually also hypnotizes all the children of the town and takes them to a place which is unknown. Right, so it's there again, human beings being being carried away by music to something that is unknown. The power of music is also a very important point there, and for Kafka as well. And he uses it via the animal. And as you rightly pointed out, Anu, we don't know whether it's really mice, but it's always there. Somehow we are always thinking or visualizing Josephine as a mouse, you know, as a beautiful mouse, a female mouse singing. That was my, I mean, that would be my addition to this. Coming back to Ankur's question about the inner life as well. I mean, we discussed this while we were discussing Metamorphoses, Ankur, and I'm glad that you put up this question. After having listened to Anu, Professor Dengle, and to Rosie, what are your comments now? I would like to know what you have gathered from the points.
Shruti, may I just?
Yes, Anjali, yes.
Before Ankur,
yes.
I just had some technical points. One is this word mention after. In very scientific terms, it's a term used to denote all primates. Anu. So we can analyze that from a very literary perspective also, as mention after being mention ähnliche after, but it's a very technical term used for all primates, which includes the Homo genus also, which includes the Homo all erectus, Homo sapiens, everything, and includes gorillas, chimpanzees, all kinds of primates. So mention Affe in German basically just means primate. So in that sense, I think we might have to relook at considering it as something like mention English or whatever. To me, it is just a technical word for primates. The other point is this idea that Darwinian evolution as the basis for explaining all these transformations is a little problematic for me, because in Darwinian evolution concept, the question of choice doesn't become so when a species evolves, it is in many ways an adaptation rather than an individual's choice. So maybe we can look at the question of whether it's an individual who is deciding, and is that individual then representative of a species. I think, Anu, you referred to that a little bit when you said it's not one species that Kafka is saying this is XYZ bug, but it is just a bug. So in that sense, that agency of the individual to decide I want to become this, in Red Peter's case, for example. So there I would like to bring in the idea of mimicry, which you also referred to, imitation. In butterflies, Professor Dengle can correct me if I'm wrong. In butterflies, we see this. There are two types of mimicry. One is a Mullerian mimicry and Batesian mimicry, so where they mimic, basically, they don't transform, they don't evolve, they don't adopt, but adaptation in the sense that they just mimic the external features of another butterfly that is unpalatable or toxic. So I think red pater is more of that rather than an evolution as a species. So maybe you could throw a little bit more light on that, whether this choice, when you say from an ape, I want to become a human, that choice, the agency to decide that is not there in Darwinian concept of evolution.
I think, Anjali, I maybe did not word it too clearly, because what I was trying to say was not that that Pater decides to become, well, he does decide to become human or decides to stop being an ape. I was just referring to the way that this process has been interpreted in various literary analyses, where various other analysts have tried to locate it in proximity to the Darwinian principle of evolution, to say, because of the direction, because in normal metamorphosis narratives, a human turns into a non-human as the result of some sort of a curse that he or she is placed under, by
that's
a
also very
hexer or something,
anthropomorphic,
yes. And in this case, again, not me, but various critics have written about this to say, in this case, the metamorphosis happens from non-human to human, which is not the case with normal traditional metamorphosis literary narratives. So because of that, people try to connect it to the Darwinian model of evolution to say, yeah, it's going in that direction. But at the same time, it is not that. It is Red Peter trying to adapt to his circumstances, which are his circumstances in a cage as a captive animal, which sees that he can never go back to the forest to be free again. And there is this whole notion of an ape is not an ape if he has no freedom, because this Freiheit is his Wesensmerkmal. So if that's gone, then basically he's not an ape anymore, but he cannot be nowhere. He has to be somewhere. The choice of going back to apeness, not there for him. He's in a cage. Becoming human, not really possible. But what he does try to do is to imitate human behavior so that people will accept him into this sort of a protective zone where he won't be killed, where somehow he will be safe, where he will be able to survive. And this thing of surviving is the second reason why people, certain scholars have again placed this narrative in proximity to the Darwinian thing, to say this evolution happens as an organism's attempt to survive, as to not go extinct. But of course, I totally agree with you, because evolution is not something that happens at the individual level. It is also not driven by choice. One does not choose to do this. So it's more taking liberties with the thought, really, that one finds. And your first point was, sorry?
About the primate, the mention after being a technical term for primate, as a scientific term for primate, and which includes humans and all the primates. So
yeah, so there again, the whole practice of naming already places the mention after in German close to the Mensch, like you said, the menschähnliche Affe, menschenähnliche Affe.
That could be an interpretation, but technically within taxonomy and biology, it's just like we say primate because of certain genetic features.
But at the level of Sprachspiel somehow,
Yeah, that can be discussed or looked at as from that angle also. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.
Are there any other observations or questions? Well, I think a lot of questions have been answered already, and it was really a pleasure listening to you, as so many other people present here have already said. And thank you so much for this lovely presentation. And I'm sure if we have questions, we will also be in touch with you. I'll ask all my students to write to you. I hope that's okay, Anu?
Absolutely. Anytime. I would be very happy to have feedback, questions, comments, suggestions, anytime.
That'll be wonderful. So I'm looking at the time as well, and we are right on time. We started at 6 and it's 8:04. So with that, I would like to thank you once again, and I would like to thank all of you for being here. And we are going to meet in 2 weeks on the 21st of April. And that will be the third guest lecture in this series. So on that note, I sign out and have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone,
Shruti.
again. Thanks,
you.
Shruti.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Good evening. Bye.
Thank you, Anuma. Thank you, Shruti, ma'am.